Every spring, the same ritual repeats itself. Garden centers fill with seed racks. Hardware stores stack pallets of fertilizer. Ads promise bigger harvests, faster growth, miracle yields. You buy seeds, prepare the soil, plant carefully, water faithfully. By autumn, the garden is exhausted. The plants are dead. The soil looks worse than it did in March. And next spring, you're told to start again, from zero. This cycle feels ancient, almost natural. Most people assume food has always worked this way. Plant in spring, harvest in summer, clear the beds, replant next year. But that assumption is wrong. It's not tradition. It's conditioning. For most of human agricultural history, food was not designed to die every year. The idea that vegetables must be replanted annually is a relatively modern concept, one that quietly took hold alongside industrial farming, seed catalogs, and chemical inputs. Today, nearly everything we grow, spinach, lettuce, carrots, cabbage, tomatoes, exists on a timer. Once it produces, it dies. And when it dies, the cycle resets. Buy again, plant again, depend again. We've been trained to believe this is efficiency. In reality, it's fragility. Look closer, and the contradiction becomes obvious. Trees don't work this way. Fruit orchards don't work this way. Grapevines don't work this way. No one replants an apple tree every year and calls it progress. Yet when it comes to vegetables, the foundation of daily calories, we accept annual death as unavoidable, normal, even desirable. But it wasn't always like this. For centuries, farmers expected food plants to return, not for 2 or 3 seasons, but for decades. They planted with the assumption that the work they did today would feed them long after the planting was forgotten. In many cases, the person harvesting a crop was not the person who planted it. That wasn't inefficiency. That was security. The modern system reverses that logic. It prioritizes speed over stability, short-term yield over long-term resilience. A plant that produces in its first year, even if it exhausts the soil and dies, is favored over one that takes patience but feeds generations. Why? Because speed fits a market. Permanence does not. When food must be replanted every year, dependency becomes built in. Seeds must be purchased. Fertility must be added back artificially. Knowledge becomes optional because products promise results without understanding. The system doesn't collapse when you stop thinking. It collapses when you stop buying. And so the lie of replanting persists, that this is how food has always been grown, that there is no alternative, that yearly death is simply nature's rule. But nature itself disagrees. In the wild, perennial plants dominate landscapes. Deep roots, long lives, regeneration instead of replacement. Annuals exist, but they are the exception, not the foundation. So why did agriculture flip that balance? The answer isn't biological. It's economic. Annual crops fit industrial timelines. They synchronize neatly with fiscal years, sales cycles, and supply chains. Perennials don't. A vegetable that produces for 20 years breaks the logic of annual profit. It removes repeat transactions. It removes urgency. It rewards patience, something markets struggle to monetize. This chapter is not about nostalgia. It's about recognizing a pattern. Somewhere along the way, we were taught that starting over every year was normal, that exhaustion was expected, that soil depletion was inevitable, that gardening should cost more every season and deliver less certainty. But once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. If replanting were truly a law of nature, humanity wouldn't have survived long enough to invent agriculture at all. The truth is simpler and more unsettling. Food didn't used to work this way. We were taught that it does. And if that's a lie, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What else were we never meant to repeat every year? Long before universities, laboratories, or agricultural colleges existed, Europe's most advanced research institutions wore stone walls and silent corridors. Medieval monasteries were not just places of prayer. They were engines of survival. In an age of famine, war, and collapse, monasteries endured because they understood something modern systems often forget. Food security is power. A monastery that could feed itself could survive sieges, crop failures, political chaos, and generations of change. And so food was never treated casually. It was planned with discipline, intention, and long horizons. This mindset was formalized in the year 800, when the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne issued a document known as the Capitulaire de Villiers. It was not a gardening suggestion. It was an imperial command. The document listed nearly 100 plants, vegetables, herbs, fruit trees, and ordered that they be grown on every royal estate and monastery across the empire. But the most important part wasn't the plant list. It was the assumption behind it. These gardens were expected to endure. They were designed to feed people not just immediately, but reliably, year after year, decade after decade. Monks took this mandate seriously. They didn't experiment casually. They standardized systems. By the 9th century, detailed garden plans were being drawn and copied. The famous plan of the monastery of St. Gall in present-day Switzerland shows something remarkable. Gardens laid out not for single harvests, but for permanence. Physic gardens for medicine. Cloister gardens for contemplation and daily greens. Orchard spaces for fruit. And within these spaces, perennial crops anchored the entire system. If a plant required constant replanting or produced only briefly, it was considered inefficient, even wasteful. Labor was precious. Land was precious. Time was precious. The monastery solution was simple: plant once, benefit for as long as possible. A bed that had to be replanted every year tied monks to endless labor. A bed that returned on its own freed them to copy manuscripts, teach novices, tend the sick, and serve surrounding villages. Efficiency was measured not by speed, but by how little effort was required over time. The best crops were the ones that demanded patience once and then asked for nothing. These gardens were not symbolic or ornamental. They fed entire communities. During famines, monasteries became lifelines, distributing food to peasants whose fields had failed. During plagues, they provided nourishment when trade collapsed. Their resilience came from redundancy and longevity. Deep-rooted perennials stabilized soil. Long-lived plants buffered bad years. Diversity prevented total failure. It was systems thinking centuries before the term existed. Knowledge did not stay locked behind monastery walls. Through trade, pilgrimage, and copied manuscripts, these practices spread outward. Manor houses adopted monastery layouts. Town gardens borrowed monastery crops. Even peasants with tiny plots learned which plants were worth planting once and keeping forever. The monastery blueprint quietly shaped European food production for centuries, not because it was romantic, but because it worked. What's striking is not how advanced these systems were, but how different their priorities were from ours. They asked one central question: how long will this feed us? Not how fast it grows, not how uniform it looks, not how easily it can be sold. Longevity was the metric. Stability was the goal. And that raises an uncomfortable realization. If medieval monks, working with hand tools and limited knowledge, could design food systems that lasted for generations, then the disappearance of those systems cannot be blamed on ignorance or failure. Something else replaced them. Something faster. Something more profitable. The monastery blueprint didn't vanish because it stopped working. It vanished because the world stopped valuing what it was designed to protect. Once you understand the monastery blueprint, the crops themselves stop looking accidental. They were chosen for one reason above all others: endurance. Medieval farmers were not interested in plants that burned bright and vanished. They wanted crops that returned, strengthened with time, and quietly accumulated value year after year. These were not side experiments or curiosities. They were the backbone of everyday food. Take asparagus. It was never treated as a vegetable for impatient people. When monks planted asparagus crowns, they accepted 3 years without harvest. 3 years of watering, weeding, and waiting. To modern eyes, that sounds irrational. But the payoff rewired the equation. Once established, asparagus returned every spring for decades. 15 years was normal. 25 was common. Some beds lasted even longer. One planting, thousands of meals. The plant's deep roots mined nutrients far below the reach of annual crops, producing spears that were denser, richer, and more flavorful than modern versions bred for speed and shipping. Then there was good King Henry, a plant so common it was planted by doors rather than in distant fields. It wasn't a specialty crop. It was survival food. Every spring, thick shoots emerged and were cut like asparagus. After that came months of leafy greens, harvested again and again without killing the plant. Later still, flowering shoots produced edible buds. One plant, 3 harvests every year. Families didn't measure it in yields per season. They measured it in years of reliability. Once planted, it simply became part of the household, like a well or a hearth. Lovage filled another role entirely. It wasn't just food, it was infrastructure. A single plant grew taller than a man and returned every spring for 20 years or more. Its leaves flavored entire pots of soup with one cutting. Its stems were eaten. Its seeds seasoned bread. Its roots were boiled or used medicinally. Lovage reduced dependence on salt, imported spices, and preserved flavor through winter. One plant replaced years of purchases. That mattered in a world where trade could collapse overnight. Root crops followed the same logic. Skirret, once prized by kings, produced clusters of sweet, white roots year after year. Harvesting didn't kill it. You took what you needed and left the rest to regenerate. Before sugar was cheap or common, this perennial root provided sweetness without refinement, processing, or annual replanting. It stayed in the ground through winter, available when little else was. Rhubarb took endurance even further. Once established, it became almost immortal. It died back each winter and returned stronger every spring, decade after decade. In some gardens, century after century. The person harvesting rhubarb often had no idea who planted it. That anonymity was the point. Food wasn't meant to be temporary or owned by a single lifetime. Artichokes introduced a different kind of permanence. Individual plants declined after several years, but they produced offsets, new plants growing from the base. Instead of starting over, gardeners divided and replanted these offsets, resetting the cycle without ever returning to seed. One original planting could be renewed indefinitely through division. The crop never truly ended. Even horseradish played its role. It was so persistent that gardeners struggled to remove it once planted. That was considered a feature, not a flaw. In poor soil, in corners, along walls, horseradish thrived where nothing else would. It demanded almost nothing and gave back endlessly. Its very aggressiveness ensured that at least one reliable food source would always survive neglect, war, or abandonment. What unites these crops is not nostalgia or novelty. It's a philosophy. They externalized patience into biology. They turned time into an ally. The longer they lived, the more valuable they became. Their roots stabilized soil. Their presence reduced labor. Their reliability reduced anxiety. Annual crops still existed, but they were secondary. They filled gaps. Perennials formed the foundation. When you view medieval gardens through this lens, something becomes clear. These crops weren't forgotten because they were obscure. They were abandoned because they were sufficient. A garden anchored in perennials doesn't restart every year. It doesn't reset dependency. It doesn't require constant buying, replacing, or correcting. These plants refuse to die, and that refusal quietly challenged the idea that food should be temporary at all. The disappearance of perennial crops was not sudden, and it was not dramatic. There were no bans, no decrees ordering them ripped from the ground. Instead, they faded quietly, replaced by something that looked like progress. Faster harvests, uniform crops, predictable timelines. What was lost in the transition was not immediately visible, but it was profound. Permanence stopped being valuable. Perennial crops are inconvenient for systems built on speed. They demand patience before reward. Asparagus asks for 3 years of waiting. Artichokes don't peak immediately. Good King Henry takes time to establish. In a subsistence economy, that patience makes sense. In a profit-driven economy, it becomes a liability. A crop that produces immediately is easier to measure, easier to sell, and easier to standardize. Annuals fit neatly into seasonal markets and yearly accounting. Perennials do not. As agriculture shifted from survival to commerce, the incentives changed. Farmers were no longer feeding just families and villages. They were feeding markets. Uniformity became more important than resilience. Speed mattered more than longevity. A plant that lived for 20 years but delayed profits for 3 was less attractive than one that paid out in a single season, even if it had to be replanted forever. The math favored repetition. The rise of seed catalogs formalized this shift. Once seeds became products rather than shared resources, annual crops became ideal. They guaranteed return customers. A gardener who planted annual spinach or cabbage would need fresh seed every year. A gardener who planted Good King Henry once would not. Over time, catalogs stopped listing long-lived vegetables, not because they failed, but because they broke the business model. What wasn't sold wasn't taught. What wasn't taught was forgotten. Industrial agriculture accelerated the process. Machinery favored uniform growth and synchronized harvests. Perennial beds, with their uneven maturity and long timelines, resisted mechanization. They didn't fit machines designed to plant, harvest, and clear fields in a single pass. Annual monocultures did. Chemical fertilizers replaced soil-building roots. Herbicides replaced diversity. Systems designed for decades were replaced by systems designed for quarters. There was also a cultural shift. Patience began to look like inefficiency. Waiting became weakness. The idea of planting something you might not personally harvest felt irrational in an economy obsessed with immediacy. Yet for most of history, that mindset was normal. People planted knowing the reward might belong to their children or grandchildren. That way of thinking didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it stopped aligning with profit. Education followed industry. Agricultural colleges focused on high-yield annuals. Extension services promoted repeat planting. Research funding flowed toward crops that could be patented, hybridized, and controlled. Perennials, difficult to patent and slow to monetize, fell outside the spotlight. Within 2 generations, entire categories of food plants vanished from common knowledge. What looks today like a natural evolution was, in reality, a narrowing of possibility. Agriculture didn't become more efficient across all measures, it became more dependent. Dependence on inputs, dependence on markets, dependence on timing and supply chains. The perennial garden, once a foundation of stability, became an inconvenience. These crops did not disappear because they failed to feed people. They disappeared because they succeeded too well without generating repeat transactions. Permanence doesn't scale profit. Fragility does. By the time anyone noticed what was gone, the system had already normalized starting over every year. The disappearance was complete, not because the plants couldn't survive, but because the economy they belonged to no longer existed. When perennial crops disappeared, the loss wasn't just botanical. It was structural. An entire way of relating to food quietly unraveled, replaced by a system that demands constant restarting. What vanished was not merely long-lived plants, but the stability they provided, stability in soil, labor, nutrition, and expectation. Modern gardening didn't become easier. It became more fragile, even as it was marketed as progress. Soil was the first casualty. Perennial plants anchor themselves deeply, holding soil in place year after year. Their roots build structure, feed microorganisms, and draw minerals from depths annual crops never reach. When those plants were replaced by shallow-rooted annuals, soil became something to be consumed rather than maintained. Nutrients were pulled out each season and had to be replaced artificially. Fertility stopped being a living process and became a product sold in bags. Labor followed the same pattern. A perennial garden front-loads effort and then rewards it with years of reduced work. An annual garden demands constant attention, tilling, sowing, thinning, replanting. The work never ends because the system resets itself every year. What once required patience became endless maintenance. Time that could have been freed for other tasks was absorbed by repetition. Nutrition changed as well. Perennial crops tend to grow more slowly and develop deeper root systems, producing denser, more mineral-rich food. Annual vegetables bred for speed and uniformity sacrifice that depth. Flavor becomes thinner. Nutrient content declines. The garden produces volume, but less nourishment. To compensate, supplements and fortified foods step in, replacing what soil once provided naturally. Perhaps the most significant loss was psychological. A perennial garden creates continuity. It connects seasons instead of erasing them. It teaches that food systems can improve with age rather than degrade. Annual systems teach the opposite lesson, that exhaustion is normal, that starting over is expected, that decline is inevitable. When every year begins from zero, resilience feels impossible. What replaced this stability was not simplicity, but consumption. Seed racks replaced saved divisions. Fertilizer bags replaced living soil. Irrigation systems replaced deep roots. Each solution required money, planning, and constant intervention. Gardening became something you managed instead of something that matured on its own. The promise was control. The reality was dependence. Instead of gardens that aged gracefully, We built systems that collapse without inputs. Instead of planting for decades, we optimized for months. Instead of measuring success by how little was required after establishment, we measured it by how much could be applied. This trade was subtle enough to escape notice. Each step seemed logical in isolation. Together, they formed a cycle that could not sustain itself without constant purchasing. The perennial garden reduced need. The annual garden multiplied it. What we lost was not just food security, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your garden will return whether you intervene or not. What replaced it was a system that works only as long as the supply chain does. And that raises the uncomfortable question. If modern methods truly represent improvement, why do they require so much more effort, expense, and replacement to produce less certainty than the systems they replaced? The choice between perennial and annual food systems is not a matter of nostalgia or ideology. It is a matter of orientation. One system assumes continuity. The other assumes replacement. Medieval farmers did not romanticize permanence. They relied on it. They planted with the expectation that food should return on its own, without renegotiation every spring. That expectation shaped everything, from how gardens were laid out to how time itself was valued. Planting a perennial is an act that stretches beyond convenience. It assumes a future. When you plant something that will not fully repay you for years, you step outside the logic of immediacy. You accept that some benefits are cumulative, not instant. That mindset is almost foreign in a world designed around quarterly returns and seasonal resets. Yet it is precisely that mindset that allowed earlier societies to build food systems that endured crisis after crisis. Freedom, in this context, is not isolation. It is resilience. A garden that feeds itself year after year reduces exposure to supply chains, price spikes, and disruptions. It lowers the number of decisions that must be made repeatedly. Once established, perennial systems ask less of you, not more. They don't demand constant correction. They reward consistency, not intensity. This does not require rejecting modern tools or knowledge. It requires questioning unnecessary repetition. You can still grow annuals. Medieval gardeners did. The difference is where you place your foundation. When perennial crops anchor a garden, annuals become optional enhancements rather than necessities. The system becomes layered instead of fragile. Reclaiming this approach does not happen all at once. It begins with a single planting. An asparagus bed meant to last decades. A clump of perennial greens by the door. A long-lived herb that replaces constant purchases. Each one quietly changes the economics of the garden. Each one reduces the number of things you must buy again next year. Over time, these choices accumulate. The garden becomes less reactive and more stable. The soil improves instead of eroding. Work shifts from constant restarting to simple harvesting. The question stops being, what do I need to add? And becomes, what can I stop replacing? Medieval farmers planted with humility. They knew they were not the center of the system, just one link in a chain that extended backward and forward through time. That humility produced abundance, not scarcity. It allowed food systems to mature rather than burn out. Modern agriculture plants for speed. Medieval agriculture planted for inheritance. The difference is not technological, it is philosophical. One assumes tomorrow must be purchased. The other assumes tomorrow can be grown. The knowledge has never truly been lost. The plants still exist. The methods still work. What's required now is not innovation, but remembrance. To plant something knowing it may outlive you is to reject the idea that everything must be temporary to be valuable. That is the quiet power of perennial food systems. They do not shout. They do not scale rapidly. They simply endure. And in a world built on constant replacement, endurance itself becomes a form of freedom.